Is there such thing as being too ugly to date as a man? And if so, at which point exactly should you call it a day, throw in the towel, wave your white flag, and choose to give up dating altogether? To avoid wasting your time, I actually have quite simple answers to both of these questions. And to make it easier to explain, I'll be using this left-right spectrum which represents all the opinions I've seen in the YouTube dating space. Here's the breakdown. At this end of the extreme, you have the hardcore Redpillers who are immensely optimistic of a man's chances, no matter his starting point. These people will likely say things such as, no man should give up. Any man can go from a 1 to a 10, men just need to climb the ladder by improving on themselves. And if you are unlucky enough to be born ugly, then you'll just need to find another way to attract. At the other end of the extreme, you have the hardcore Blackpillers. They'll say things like, modern dating is completely ruined. It's fully over for sub-5s now, and in 10 years' time for normies too. In today's age, if you're not born a Chad, you may as well give up forever. Now, I wouldn't go as far as either of these sides of the extreme, but if I had to choose, I'd position myself slightly closer to this side than the other. This is the point which I believe indicates realism, and like almost all things where there are two sides of either extremes, you'll usually find the most realistic answer falls somewhere in the middle. This is what I'm going to be exploring in this video, and in particular raising counter-arguments to the extremely optimistic side, which I believe is over-represented at the moment. So without wasting any more time on the intro, let's get into it. Firstly, what does the optimistic side get right? Well, what they preach is definitely encouraging. It pushes men to work and try to maximise their potential. However, I sometimes see that potential gets conflated with delusion, causing many guys to get a completely unrealistic idea of what's possible for them, so they end up becoming extremely out of touch with reality. An example of this would be a 5'6", bald, 3 out of 10 face man thinking just with enough time and effort, he can eventually reach the level of Chris Hemsworth. Now sure, I'm all for hard work, but having unrealistic goals isn't helping anyone, and in fact, it causes a new issue altogether as it sets men's expectations far too high, which can set them up to fail. I see many men out there get sucked in by the promises told to them by various dating gurus. You can transform your dating life in just 6 weeks of hard work. I've had clients that went from no dates at all to having 5 in their first 10 days. Now, the fundamental issue with claims like these is that they're over-promises. It causes men to become delusional at first, and then later down the line disheartened as they realise what they were promised at the start is far from being grounded in reality. So, the inevitable result is that they give up. I've experienced this in the past myself and have an entire video explaining my story. Link will be below, check it out at the end. Anyway, the next issue I have is when we zoom out from the individual and look at everybody. This idea that every man has a chance I find also to be misleading. And I can actually prove mathematically why this cannot be true. In the Western world, for 18 to 29-year-olds, there are, on average, 105 men for every 100 women. So, if we assume everyone dates across to people the same age as them, by the end, there will always be 5 men for every 100 who get left out. And no, dating up or down any number of years won't help either, because that just puts pressure on those age groups. This explains why now we're seeing a particularly bad situation for young guys in their late teens and early 20s, as many other men in their upper 20s and even early 30s are all trying to chase the same hot young women. Furthermore, bear in mind that this 105 to 100 is a best case scenario, as many dating coaches encourage the optimal dating life for guys to be dating multiple women at one time, which only puts more strain on the availability of women, therefore causing an even higher percentage of men to be forced out of the market. This explains why there is a growing gap between men and women who haven't had intimacy since turning 18. too many men at the top are monopolising. Anyway, what this notion of every man has a chance fails to recognise is that dating is and always will be a zero-sum game. Meaning, if I raise myself up, your rank in the hierarchy automatically lowers. If I date 5 women all at once, that's 5 women you can no longer date. Now, a counter-argument people often raise to this point is that only those who try will have a chance. And those who don't? Well, tough. In other words, it doesn't matter if there's more men than there are women. It doesn't matter if you're currently in the bottom 5% or if you have to reach the top 20% to be successful. None of these things matter because the percentage of men that actually try and actually want to reach that top 20% is so low that now all you have to do is put in enough work ensuring your own safety without worrying about anyone else. So it's basically changing the quote slightly from every man has a chance instead to every man has a chance if he's willing to try and everyone else is sitting around lazy. However, what even this idea fails to recognise is that every man has a ceiling of how high he can climb. And for a lot of guys, even if they dedicate their absolute best efforts, they'll still fall short of the top 20% assuming they've already reached their potential. A great example of this is that since I started doing face ratings on Fiverr about a year ago, I've now had quite a lot of people who've come back to get a year's worth of progress update rating. And for these that have done this, they usually fall into one of 2 groups. 1, they've had a big jump in improvement. We're talking 2 to 3 points here, because they've either lost some weight or got jacked, which has transformed their appearance. Then 2, other guys who have barely moved the needle in terms of getting a higher score. And when I tell these men their score hasn't changed, they often get bitter and leave an angry comment like, "How is this possible? Did you even look at my photos? I've been on self-improvement for the last year. How can it be my score is the exact same?" Well, why has this happened? The answer, of course, is because once you reach a certain level of self-improvement, it then becomes mostly about maintaining rather than climbing that happens in the beginning. And adding even more to this, there's this fantastic video online where a man shows 5 years of his calisthenics progress. And within the first 3 years, his transformation really is astounding. His value goes up from about a 4 to a 7. However, once he gets to this point, for the next 1.5 years he's more or less the same. And that's not because he's training less or not as hard as he used to, it's because he's already close to his ceiling, so the rate of improvements has slowed down dramatically. It's similar to how I discovered in my 1000 face ratings video, that despite the fact that jacked guys were on average 1 point higher than men with ordinary physiques, there were still 14% of guys that were jacked and sub-5s. This shows for all of these jacked men, they're either already at or as close as they can get to their ceiling. Anyway, the points I want to drill home from this is that when it comes to looks, every man has a ceiling of what they can reach. And that's not to say you shouldn't strive towards your ceiling. I'm all for hard work, but it's still important to recognise you have one and understand you have limits. For men between the ages of 18 and 25, your curve for looks should look like this. So you start off low, but you get close to your peak in a couple years and then it flattens off. It's also worth noting your initial starting point significantly dictates how high your ceiling will be. A man who is a 6 at age 18 has a much higher chance of eventually reaching an 8 compared to a guy that starts off as a 3. This leads nicely to my final critique of the overly optimistic guys, which is this idea of, if you're born ugly, you just need to find another way to attract. And of all the points covered so far, I probably disagree with this one the most. SMV has 4 components: looks, money, status, and social skills. And this idea that a man can forego looks and just focus on the other 3 is completely nonsensical. Firstly, a lot of the time these things work in tandem. For example, social skills are often built off of being good looking in the first place. Then, those social skills can open doors, allowing you to excel in job interviews which can give you access to money. Then, you can leverage that money to gain even more looks, or alternatively status by doing something like hiring a pro photographer, so you can use the photos to create a top 5% Instagram profile. Secondly, it's almost always better to have your eggs spread across all of these things, rather than having them all in one basket. Everyone knows that women have a list of requirements that is getting longer by the day. And I believe it's more common for a woman to reject a guy for what he doesn't have, rather than accept a guy for what he does have. For example, a guy might have a great face, good job, and social circle, but if she found out he was short, like really short, say 5'5", she'd reject him. The way I like to put it is that scores don't add, they multiply. E.g., a lot of people wrongly assume that if you're a 2 in one factor, like looks, and an 8 in 2 other factors, like money and status, it means your average is a 6. Not bad for a 2 out of 10 in looks. However, in reality, because the scores multiply, your real score is actually far worse. 2 times 8 times 8 is 128, which when compared to having straight 6s across the board, we see is almost half as good, because having the 6s multiplies to 216. So, the more consistent your scores, the higher your average will be. In other words, in almost all cases, a woman would prefer a guy who has all of the boxes ticked. Not necessarily to the max, but enough so that she can introduce him to her parents and they won't be glaring at the one major flaw the guy has. Anyway, to bring this back to the original topic of the video, when it comes to whether you should give up or not, I believe it's about balance. There will be some guys that can and will climb the ranks and have successful dating lives. Then there'll be others who either because they're at their ceiling already or are just plain lazy will remain stuck where they are. So, I think the best outlook is be realistic with your current chances, think about what your potential could be after improving, and finally reach a grounded conclusion of what the best course of action for your dating life will be in future. And if that means giving up so you can focus on what else life has to offer, or taking an extreme measure to get a hold of your dating life, then so be it. That's all. If you've enjoyed, make sure you press the like button on your way out and leave any thoughts you have in the comments below, as it all helps the YouTube algorithm.